3 seasons, Barry has proven to be one of the darkest and somehow funniest shows on TV. I don't know a show out there that makes me laugh at more awful things than Barry does, and also makes me feel a sense of dread at the same time. Aside from just being the star of the show, Bill Hader is also the lead writer and director on many of the episodes. And you could tell that he has his hands all over this thing because it definitely has a very unique tone. So being as dark as it was, I don't think Barry was ever heading towards a happy ending at all. But it does manage to pull off something I didn't think it would, which is maybe the darkest ending possible. My name is Kanye East, and you are watching Wit and Whimsy. The spoiler-free review. Whew, that's a tough ask of myself. I will say that as dark and funny as you'd expect the ending of Barry to be, it mostly is. Aside from a few pacing choices that really threw me through a loop, I think it's business as usual with Bill Hader at the helm. Things feel very sharp, they feel very poignant, and I think they did a great job of tying up just about every loose end this show had before it ended. I just think there was a couple decisions that ended up hurting the show in the long run and ended up creating a few plot holes. But beyond that, season 4 of Barry is an 8 out of 10 for me. Wow. I mean, I think we all knew that Barry was most likely either going to die or suffer some really kind of dark fate. There was probably no way out for him that involved light. Although, in a way, I do feel like the show almost lets him off the hook at the very end, which is, you could say is, not a good choice. But I actually thought the idea to make Barry's legacy redeemed, not the character, but his legacy redeemed, is the darkest thing they could have done. I think this show is not about justice. It's really not. And no characters in this show really get justice. And I think that is kind of a very, very unfortunately realistic way of depicting this. Because Barry, never really has this violent showdown with Hank and Fuchs that we all expect. They all shoot each other, and something I didn't really expect, a big shootout where all their men die, and Hank dies. The only one who survives it is Fuchs, and then Barry's son, because Fuchs saved him, and we find out that Sally also survived. But it was kind of a strange moment of meditation before Fuchs and Hank eventually trade guns. I really did think it was interesting that Fuchs is so psychological now. Do really have to give some praise to Stephen Root's performance as Fuchs. Not that I ever doubted the guy could act, but I feel like it was on full display these last few episodes just because of how different Fuchs was in the past timeline to the future timeline. There's a big difference in the way that Fuchs plays that character, in ways that the other characters don't really change as drastically as he does. But I believed every second of all of it. And I thought it was kind of a not redemption for Fuchs, but, the best possible ending for him. I think Fuchs still carries a lot of guilt for getting Barry involved in basically the events that screwed up his life. I'm not trying to say that people don't have choices or all that, but I think Fuchs definitely recognizes his role as a manipulator in manipulating this young person with a talent for violence. And he says that in his little dialogue with Hank, that he used to use people who were, better skilled than him to act out things that he wanted to do himself. And so I think he felt a lot of guilt, and that dialogue was really well timed, because when he sees Barry's son, I feel like his first instinct is to protect him from the life of violence that he feels like he brought to Barry. And I think Barry almost believes it too, because when Barry shows up, I think some people might have expected Barry to shoot Fuchs, but I kind of really got it why he didn't, because I think he recognized in that moment that he rescued John. Aside from just being grateful that Fuchs rescued his son, I think Barry also realized that he kind of tried to atone. And Barry's now all about this Christian dogma of forgiveness. So I think that, all those things kind of lined up really perfectly for Barry to just say, hey, I'm going to let it go. After all that they've been through together and all the hurt they've caused each other, let's just leave it at that. I think Sally probably had one of the most depressing arcs of the season. I think it was kind of, it's good. It's a very good character arc, but it's something that's going to make you very, very sad. And I think by the end, it's almost kind of like a place of acceptance that, she wasn't really at before then. To recap kind of Sally's arc of the entire show, she comes from an abusive relationship. It's almost her defining point, which is something I think is, reinforced, this idea that she's defined by her trauma and by Jean, unfortunately. And it's slowly later brought up in this season that tactic Jean used in season 1 was actually kind of abusive, to pick on people's trauma and make that their defining point. Sally should be bigger than her abuse. She should be bigger than that moment. But I kind of like that the show just really took her to that place of being what is the end game of being that's your thing that defines you. And I think we saw it end up being for her that she ends up being kind of an emotional abuser herself in a lot of ways, not only to her employees like she was last season when she had the entitled cunt video. I can't remember the name of it, but she had that go viral, kind of lost her reputation. But then even when she's trying to teach at Gene Cousineau's school, she realizes that the Cousineau method was not very good for people. I think it was a defining moment for her. I think she kind of felt like she was trapped by that. She was trapped by that cycle of abuse. And I think that was just so sad. It was such a sad moment, because I can't think of any other reason why when Barry shows up after he gets out of prison, he would just go hey, let's run away together. And she's like, yeah, let's do it. Her self-esteem has hit rock bottom. Way lower than it ever was when she was getting abused by her last boyfriend. Way lower than it ever was when she gets shouted at by Barry in season 3, which was a crazy scene. And even way lower than she was when she was acting as the abuser herself. I feel like she's just kind of lost all self-esteem. She doesn't believe in herself anymore. She feels like every time she tries in this town of Hollywood, she just gets turned down. She can't do anything the right way. And it's such a, unfortunately, I think, realistic thing that happens to a lot of people out there in Hollywood, where they just try and try and try and they can't make it. It's heartbreaking. So Sally's lost everything. I kind of get why she just goes with Barry in a way. I think she thinks that, aside from the fact that she also thinks she's a murderer, she's just got nothing left in her that says, I'm a person that deserves good things. The only thing that didn't work for Sally's story for me this season was the very, very end. I'm talking basically the last sequence. So after Barry is killed and years later. See, it seems like Sally, even in episode 8, still holds herself accountable for the murder of the guy that broke into her house. And I mean, from what I remember, the murder was pretty much self-defense, I would say. It would seem like Barry tried to make it seem like, oh no, this is bad, because he wanted to make Sally feel more like him. He was emotionally manipulative in that moment, trying to make Sally feel just as bad as he feels for all the death that he's caused, that way he wouldn't be alone. Because if she found out he was a killer and things were getting close to that moment, then, he would need her to think she is too if she's going to go along with it. But I just felt like it was kind of, it's weird, Sally's position on it, because all that happens, and even in episode 8 when she's, held captive by Hank, she tells her son, me and your father have killed people. I killed a person. We were fugitives. Which just makes me feel like, were they? Was Sally a fugitive? Was Sally ever found out to have murdered that one guy? And it just felt kind of odd for her to say that. And maybe you could say it was just like a split moment thing. Maybe she feels the guilt and that's enough. But it's just odd because in the very last sequence, we see Sally years later seemingly over the fact that she murdered someone. Like, it's like she's out in the open. I'm still me. Because people know that the movie that's made about Barry is about John and Sally. So, like, people know who she is. It's not a secret identity anymore. So I just wish that they could have, explained that a little bit further. Which brings me back to my biggest complaint about this show this season was the time jumps. I am not a fan of time jumps usually. And I think this season really didn't need to do them the way that they did them. Like, we find out, like, within one episode, Barry has a son. Like, within one scene, they jump, 10 years or whatever it was. I don't know how old John was at the time, but that was really jarring. I think a lot of that was meant to be jarring. But still, I just feel like I'm not a big fan of time jumps, but especially the very last one, which is, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years after Barry's death, and Sally and John have relocated, and John is played by the kid from It. There's just, like, a really big gap that made me wonder what happened to Sally during that time. Like, what did she end up, like, thinking in her head? What happened with the murder? Was she still a fugitive? Like, we never really got closure on Sally's murder. I imagine they probably never find the guy. So maybe Sally in her head was just like, well, I'm just going to move on, and maybe she came to that realization that it was like self-defense, that she wasn't really killing people the way that Barry was. But I don't really like that off-screen development. I kind of wish that would be one thing, if anything, that they at least address with some kind of line of dialogue at the very end. That's kind of my biggest complaint, is just that the time jumps, while I could see them trying to do it to fit everything into one season, I almost just wish that they had done another season and had that all happen, maybe season 4.1, 4.2, same way that, like, Breaking Bad split up its final season, and then we got to establish who all the characters are now that we've done this big time jump, which required a lot of work. We had to find out who Hank was. Now he's running his own company. Fuchs is a completely different person, the Raven. Gene is, like, more depressed than he's ever been because he shot his son. Another thing that I just felt like we never really, like, found out what happened, really, until they're, like, one scene towards the end. We find out his son's even still alive. It was decisions like that. I think it just made me wonder too much what was going on. That mystery was distracting me away from the plot moving forward as it was. Like, it was harder for me to be concerned that Gene was going to talk to Warner Brothers about Barry to make a movie when I didn't even know that his son was still alive. Because last I saw his son, he was, shot and bleeding at Gene's cabin door. Right? So stuff like that, I think that the time jumps, they just make it harder. They make it harder for an unnecessary reason, I think. Another big criticism of this season for me was Barry's character in particular, where I feel like Barry had a very distinct character in season 1 and 2. He changed drastically in season 3 and seemingly overnight. Like, his guilt kind of caught up with him for the first time. And I was fine with it because it felt like a between seasons thing, right? So now Barry is completely unhinged in season 3. Okay, that's fine. But he went from being that to just being completely out of touch with reality when he's, like, got his son now, right? Like, he's a completely different person with John around. He's quoting Bible verses and all this stuff, and I guess, like, we can maybe see that as a natural progression of his unhingedness. I don't think that's a word, but I said it anyway. I think that's probably a natural progression, but it just happens, in 5 minutes because we got that huge time jump. And it just feels jarring. I understand 10 years happened in between that time, but it's going to be very jarring when you have 10 years of development happen within the span of 2 minutes. And it kind of pulled me out a little bit. That's why I think the biggest problem is if I could just watch the show the same way that I normally would and watch characters naturally progress, then it would be more enjoyable. I'd be able to sink my teeth into all the, the craziness that's going on, all the action, all the suspense, because there was plenty of it this season. But the time jumps and character changes, a lot of that stuff just made it very hard to digest very quickly. It was kind of a overstimulation at times. Overall, though, obviously I still think Barry is like one of the best shows ever. I think it maybe had potential to be perfect, and so I think that's why I'm a little disappointed that I don't think it was, because I think seasons 1 and 2 and 3, particularly season 3, I think season 3 was like 10 out of 10 for me. I don't think season 3 could have been any better than it was. It was just so intense, so crazy. I had to watch like every episode after each one ended. I was like, God damn it, I don't want to wait a week, to watch it. It was just so damn good. Season 4, I just didn't feel that way. Like it definitely achieved its goal of wrapping things up in a way that makes sense. It's fittingly dark. And I think it took the characters to a lot of logical conclusions and some satisfying ends. It's like, it's sad to see a lot of them go the way that they did, but it's just like, that's Barry. It wouldn't be Barry if they all had a nice happy ending. It makes sense that they would double down on the darkest parts of their souls, and they really went there with everybody, with Hank, with Sally, with Barry, and even with Fuchs. In a way, he's kind of almost sort of redeemed, but I mean, he's also the Raven now, right? Like he's a killer. He's a stone cold killer now, right? So basically, everybody reverts to their most bad state by the end of this one. And almost everything ends in the darkest way possible, right? Like, Gene's the one who shoots Barry, so he goes to jail for the murder of Barry, but he's also under suspicion for killing Janice, which she didn't even do. So, dark ending for Gene, who's spending life in prison, and his reputation is also ruined because he's still being pinned for all that shit. He's still being connected to drug money from the Chechens, so people think that he's the one who was killing people and framing Barry for it. Barry is buried at Arlington with honors. If that is not the darkest ending for this show possible, I don't know what is, because it maintains his legacy, which is kind of the biggest theme of this season. They talk about in the first episode where we see Barry and his family in the desert, and he's talking about Abe Lincoln and how he had such a troubled legacy, right? And so Barry becomes very concerned with that same thing. Like, is he going to be remembered for the right things? And in a way, he was. But the bad thing is, he was a shit person. Like, Barry is a bad guy, and he only got worse. And it's a very dark ending to just give that guy basically exactly what he wanted for his legacy, especially in regards to his son, to be intact. Sally ends up kind of maybe sort of not happy, but probably the best ending for her, because after going into her darkest place, especially in the desert, she's kind of left off with a sense of, I don't need no man. And I mean, I'm saying that in like a really, oversimplification of the whole thing, but it really seemed like she was finally learning that she needs to learn to be independent first, learn to love herself, something she's never been able to do because all the men in her life have been, either physical abusers or hitmen and emotional abusers, right? She's finally at a place in her life where she can just let go of that and be the closest thing she can be to happy, which I thought was almost kind of nice for Sally. Obviously, it was a great season. Bill Hader is never going to make a bad season of Barry. It was not bad by any means, but I think, and maybe this is my fault for giving it too much credit, but I really expected it to be either perfect or near perfect, and I don't think it was. So it kind of has to come down a couple points for me because of all the time jumps. I think I said an 8 originally. Maybe I'll give it an 8.5. Now that I think about it, it was very satisfying in a lot of ways, and I'll give it an 8.5. I'm like maybe an 8.25. I don't know if I allow myself to do quarters on the scales. 8.25. I'm gonna leave it at that.